Well, welcome to episode 401 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Sun Ra. It came out in 1962 on Savoy Records. It's called The Futuristic Sounds of Sun Ra. And this is the 2022 Kraft Records reissue, which I gather, and I think it's probably true, sounds as good, if not better, than the original. Sun Ra is an artist like nobody else in jazz, making music which sounded plausibly as though it came from the planet he claimed to have visited, Saturn. He was an innovator in electronic music, avant garde music, and arguably in performance art. And his band contained some brilliant musicians who might have become leaders in their own right had they not chosen to follow their leader's eccentric musical vision. Sun Ra was also probably the leading self publisher in jazz, producing and distributing his own records, creating a discography which pretty much defies any rational attempt at cataloging. The original, like almost all Sun Ra records, is extraordinarily difficult to find, and because Sun Ra was in the habit of pressing his own records, the quality of those original pressings is a little bit hit or miss. But because this is a Kraft Recordings release, we know that the people involved in the remastering and the reissue have all apprenticed for years at an obscure mountaintop retreat in Bulgaria and have mastered the art of turning water into wine. And it is true, this sounds fantastic and no doubt much better than the original. Sun Ra and I share a birthday, May 22nd, but he was born a little bit before me in 1914 in Birmingham, Alabama. His birth name was Herman Blunt, and he was quickly nicknamed Sonny. As his habit was to spin many tales about his origins, it's taken a while for the facts to emerge. We do know that he was a prodigy on piano and began composing music as a preteen. He would go and see big bands that visited Birmingham, bands like Fletcher Henderson's or Duke Ellington's, and when he came home, he would transcribe their music onto the page from memory. He went to the segregated industrial high school in Birmingham and by his mid teens was performing anywhere it was appropriate for someone of his age. His family were very religious, but not in the sense of organized religion. He was a quiet kid, he was an avid reader. He also had a condition called cryptorchidism, which gave him a lot of pain and led to him being quite socially isolated. At age 20, he leaves home to go and tour in support of a singer called Ethel Harper, who had been his high school biology teacher. She eventually leaves the tour to go and try her luck in New York, and Sonny renames the band the Sonny Blunt Orchestra. And although that didn't last, the whole experience convinced him that he could have a career in music. He was soon accepted as a music major on scholarship at Alabama A&M, but he dropped out in his first year. Why? Well, in later years, he would explain that he had had an out-of-body experience in that first year. He'd been surrounded by a bright light, and he was taken by aliens to Saturn, where he was told that the Earth was in trouble, that the black race needed him to speak through music to save them. His biographer notes that this account seems to emerge in about 1952, referring back to events in 1936, but all his band members subsequently recall being told that he was sent from outer space to save the black race through music. Following his return from Saturn to Birmingham, he immersed himself in music. He sets up a rehearsal space, he invites all kinds of musicians to join him, and he soon forms a new Sonny Blunt orchestra. He had a terrible time during the war. He was drafted in 1942, registered as a conscientious objector, but he was denied. He was sent to jail and then eventually to a mental hospital in Pennsylvania. Following that, he was reclassified as unfit for service and he returned to Birmingham, understandably quite bitter. In 1945, he moves to Chicago, where he starts working for a singer called Wynonie Harris, and it's with Harris that he appears on record for the very first time on a track called Dig This Boogie in 1946. That year, he joined the orchestra of Fletcher Henderson, and after that, he worked in a trio with Coleman Hawkins and Stuff Smith. He also absorbed the vibrant black intellectual and spiritual life of post war Chicago, and he became fascinated with Pan Africanism. In 1952, he decided to shed his birth name, considering it a slave name, and he took the name Le Sonny Ra in homage to the Egyptian god. It quickly gets shortened to Sun Ra. He soon began to create the band, which would become known as the Orchestra, starting with the drummer Bugs Hunter and the sax player Pat Patrick. He soon welcomed two other players, John Gilmore on tenor and Marshall Allen, a former Buffalo soldier, on alto. Both were stellar talents and both would be at the core of his band for decades. He also met a young intellectual called Alton Abraham, who fed his interest in offbeat and esoteric subjects and soon became his manager. They fed off each other, they gave each other ideas, and around Sun Ra emerges this kind of musical Pan-Africanist salon featuring a utopian Astro Black mythology. They formed their own record label, L Saturn Records, in 1955. Sun Ra was one of the very first musicians to do so, and released a couple of records in the 1950s, Supersonic Jazz in 1957 and Jazz in Silhouette in 1959. But those two records were preceded in their recording by the first ever orchestra LP, Jazz by Sun Ra, which was recorded in 1955 by a little label called Transition and released in 1957. This so called Chicago era of Sun Ra's music was by definition big band jazz, but not as we know it, Jim. The music was good, or it was eccentric, or it was modern. Depended who you asked, and it was probably fair to call it all three. It was, to my ears, kind of like big band meets hard bop. That era also saw the band adopt stage outfits with a kind of pseudo Egyptian theme, or maybe what you might call outer space chic. It was part serious, part tongue in cheek, but it became a band trademark. The Chicago era comes to an end sometime in 1961 when Sun Ra, Gilmore, Allen, and a few other members of the band decide to borrow one of their dad's cars, drive to Montreal for a while, play some gigs, and then on the way back home to stop off in New York to see some old friends. Their car gets hit by a taxi on the George Washington Bridge. They don't have money to fix it, so they decide to stay. They added new members, and eventually, over the next couple of years, they established a commune of sorts at 48 East 3rd on the Lower East Side, a house that became known as the Sun Palace, and it was also their rehearsal space. Sun Ra has a smaller band at this point, but it's tight, and they're making lots of music. And in the fall of 1962, the orchestra travels across the river to New Jersey to make this record. This record is made on October 10th, 1961, at Medallion Studios in Newark, New Jersey. The producer is Tom Wilson, who had produced the orchestra's own debut LP for Transition in 1955. It has what I would call Dali inspired cover art done by the mysterious artist Harvey, who did so many record covers for Savoy. And it's been called chamber music bebop, which I think is a little bit unfair. The more direct musical analogy I would say is it's kind of like Yusuf Lateef at his most whimsical. It's music that's played seriously, but doesn't take itself seriously. Sun Ra plays piano. The horn section is Bernard McKinney, Marshall Allen, John Gilmore, and Pat Patrick, between them employing a trombone, a euphonium, an alto, tenor, and bass sax, a bass clarinet, a western flute, and a Japanese shakuhachi flute. Ronnie Boykins plays bass, Willie Jones plays drums, and Leah Nanda is on the conga. And for you Canadians out there, a little bit of trivia, Leah Nanda eventually retires to Salt Spring Island in 1978. Finally, one more musician, Ricky Murray, provides vocals on China Gate. Side one starts with Bassism, a quirky track which makes me smile. The big band sound is certainly gone, but this is not a small combo either. It's still a big sound. Of Sounds and Something Else has some great soloing by that horn section. On What's That, here we get more of an avant garde flavor with discordance between the horn harmonies and the soloists and a decidedly out piano solo. The next two tracks, Where's Tomorrow and The Beginning, are even more discordant and avant garde, heavy on percussion, on which all orchestra members doubled, and lots of quirky woodwinds. And the last track on side one is China Gates, which is a cover, unusual for Sun Ra. It was written by Victor Young for the 1957 film of the same name, with Nat King Cole singing it in the film. On side two, New Day is a percussion heavy, Eastern flavored track that the conga really makes swing. Tapestry from an Asteroid has a beautiful piano intro from Sun Ra, and then a lovely statement of the theme by Bernard McKinney's trombone. Jet Flight is probably the most bebop flavored track with a staccato tenor solo from Gilmore. Looking Outward, for me, has a little bit of the feel of Ravel's Bolero thanks to the percussion. And the record finishes with Space Jazz Reverie. Yes, that is exactly what this is. And it's also a feature for both Sun Ra and Bernard McKinney. Sun Ra's music had many different eras and therefore many different pivotal records, and this is one of those pivotal records. It occurs at the beginning of his New York phase. He's moving from this relatively more conventional big band group to the more experimental sounds that he'd pursue in New York. And of course, he'd then take a whole different tack when he got to Philadelphia at the end of the decade. But I picked this one to review first because I think it's one of his more accessible records, and it gives you a sense of where he's going and where he's been without necessarily putting people off or frightening them. Now, lots of people will get into Sun Ra because they want to be frightened, and certainly you can do that. But this one, it may be discordant, it may be a little bit unconventional, but it still swings. The track list is certainly varied, but it doesn't stretch between too many styles to leave the record with a loss of focus. No, it feels like a coherent piece of art. It also features some excellent musicianship. There may be no consensus entry point into Sun Ra's catalog, but this record is as good a candidate as any. And for me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.